Good evening, friends of the journal. Draw the curtains, if you haven't already. Let the kettle go cold on the hob. Tonight we are going back through the fog, back through the gaslight, back to a narrow set of rooms above a tobacconist's on Baker Street, where a fire is always low and a violin is always somewhere close at hand. I keep this journal for reasons I have never fully explained, even to myself. Perhaps it is only that a man who has seen the things I have seen cannot simply let them go quiet in his mind. Perhaps it is that some tales are too strange, too sad, or too tender for the newspapers, and so they wait here instead, folded into these pages, until someone is ready to listen. If you're new to these evenings with me, welcome, settle in, and if you've been with me before, well, you already know what to do. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop. There is nothing required of you tonight except to listen and perhaps, before you drift away, to tap that little subscribe button so that Watson's Journal finds its way back to your pillow again tomorrow night. It costs you nothing, and it means rather a great deal to me. Now, no more of that. Let us begin the knock. It was a few minutes shy of 1 o'clock in the morning when the knocking came, and I have known few sounds in my long association with Sherlock Holmes that unsettled me half so much. Understand that Baker Street at that hour was not a place given to callers. The rain had been falling since dusk in that particular, relentless, patient way that London rain falls in late autumn. Not dramatic, not violent, simply endless, drumming on slate roofs and running in black ropes from the gutters. I had been dozing in the chair by our fire, a book of Holmes's chemistry notes slack in my lap, when the bell below sounded once, then twice, then a third time in quick and desperate succession. Holmes was already at the window before I had properly opened my eyes. "A hansom, left waiting in the rain with the horse uncovered," he murmured, more to himself than to me, one hand drawing back the edge of the curtain. A man who did not think to instruct his driver to seek shelter. A man, therefore, who was not thinking of anything at all beyond the door in front of him. We heard Mrs. Hudson's slippered feet upon the stair, her voice raised in mild protest, and then footsteps taking the steps two at a time, the footsteps of youth, or of terror, or both. The door burst open without so much as a knock upon it, and a man stood swaying in the frame, hatless, his evening coat soaked through and clinging to his shoulders, his face the colour of tallow in the lamplight. "Mr. Holmes!" His voice cracked on the name. "Mr. Holmes! You must come! Now!" Tonight. There is no one else who... He stopped, pressed a fist to his mouth, and for a moment I thought the man might simply collapse where he stood. Holmes did not move from the window. He had a way, at such moments, of becoming perfectly still, as though stillness itself were a kind of listening. "Sit down, sir, before you fall down," said he, "and tell us, if you can, what has happened." The man did not sit. He gripped the doorframe instead, knuckles white, and when he spoke again, his words came in a rush, half-formed, tumbling over one another like water over a broken weir. "My daughter, she is gone, Mr. Holmes. Gone from a room with the door bolted from the inside and the window painted shut these 10 years past. Gone from a house with every soul in it awake and listening, on the very eve of her wedding, and I tell you there is no way out of that room, sir. No way out at all, and yet she is not in it." He drew one long, ragged breath. "The door was locked, Mr. Holmes. I broke it down myself, not an hour ago, with my own 2 hands, and the room inside is empty." Holmes let the curtain fall. He said nothing further. He did not need to. I already knew, from the particular quality of the silence that followed, that we would not see our beds again that night, and that somewhere across the city, in a bridal chamber with a bolted door, something had happened that had no business happening at all. Chapter 1. The empty bridal chamber. The house stood on a quiet street in Whitechapel, one of those respectable islands that exist even in the poorest districts of London, where a family may work for 2 generations to keep its windows clean and its curtains unfrayed, and where the neighbours know precisely how much a wedding costs and precisely how much it means. Our client, who gave his name at last as Josiah Fairweather, wool merchant, sat opposite us in the cab and said almost nothing during the whole of the drive, only turning his hat over and over in his hands, as though it were a puzzle he might solve if he turned it enough times. The rain had not slackened. It streaked the cab windows into long, wavering ribbons of lamplight, and Holmes watched the streets go by, with his chin sunk into his collar and his eyes half closed, in that attitude I had long ago learned did not mean sleep, but its very opposite. "Your daughter's name, Mr. Fairweather," said Holmes, without turning his head. "Eleanor." The word came out of him like something breaking. "Eleanor Fairweather. Tomorrow she was to have become Eleanor Carraway. And the groom, Edmund Carraway, a barrister. A good match, Mr. Holmes. A very good match indeed." He said this last with a peculiar heaviness, as though the goodness of the match were itself a kind of grief. We drew up before the house a few minutes later, and I confess that even in that brief glimpse through the rain, I felt the particular hush that hangs over a home in crisis. Every window on the ground floor blazed with light, though it was gone 1 in the morning. A constable stood uncertainly by the gate, sent for by some frightened servant, and now unsure what, precisely, he had been sent for. Fairweather waved him off with a distracted hand, and led us up the steps and into a hallway thick with the smell of beeswax candles, and, beneath it, the fainter, sourer smell of fear. The bridal chamber was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow passage lined with the sort of family portraits that follow a household through 3 or 4 generations without anyone quite remembering who half the sitters were. The door to the room hung crooked upon one hinge, the wood about the bolt splintered pale and raw where Fairweather had forced it. Holmes paused before entering, and I watched him take in the whole of that doorway, the angle of the splinters, the depth of the gouge where the bolt had torn free, the dust disturbed upon the frame, in perhaps 3 seconds, though I knew he would carry the memory of it, complete and exact, for the rest of his life if the case required it. "You broke this down yourself," he said. "It was not a question." "I did. My man Grigson helped me with the last of it, but the first blows were mine. And before you broke it, you are certain the bolt was thrown?" "I heard it thrown myself, Mr. Holmes, not 3 hours before. Eleanor bolted her own door every night. She had done so since she was a girl, ever since." He stopped himself, and something moved behind his eyes that I marked, and that I am certain Holmes marked far more precisely than I. It was a habit of hers, nothing more. Holmes let this pass, for the moment, and stepped into the room. "I want you to see it as I saw it, because I have never, in all my years beside Sherlock Holmes, entered a chamber that unsettled me quite so thoroughly as that one did. Not through any violence in it, for there was none, but through the sheer, patient wrongness of its emptiness. It was a pleasant room, or had been. A fire had burned down to embers in the grate, throwing a dim orange light across a wardrobe. A dressing table crowded with the small treasures of a young woman on the eve of the greatest change in her life. A hairbrush, a box of pins, a spray of dried lavender tied with ribbon. The bed had been turned down, one side of it, as though someone had begun to prepare for sleep and had been interrupted, or had simply changed their mind. A wedding gown of pale silk hung upon the wardrobe door, untouched, its long sleeves hanging empty and still in the firelight, like a second, ghostly occupant of the room. And there was no one there, no one at all. I confess I went first to the window, for it seemed to me the obvious place to look, and Fairweather, watching me, gave a short, bitter laugh. "You'll find it painted shut, Doctor. Has been these 10 years. I had it done myself, after." Again that catch, that swallowed sentence. After an accident some years back, a window left open, and a chill that nearly cost this family a great deal more than a wedding. I have not opened that window since, nor allowed it to be opened, and I defy any man to prise it loose without leaving a mark a blind man could find. I tried it, nonetheless, and found him quite correct. The old paint had sealed the sash into its frame as thoroughly as if it had been soldered, and there was no sign, that I could see in that dim light, of it having been disturbed. Holmes, meanwhile, had not gone to the window at all. He was on his knees by the hearth, quite motionless, his long, pale fingers resting lightly upon the floorboards, as though he were taking the pulse of the room itself. "There is no chimney flue large enough for a cat to pass, let alone a grown woman," said Fairweather, watching him. "I have already thought of that, Mr. Holmes, and had Grigson measure it besides." "I do not doubt you," said Holmes quietly, without looking up. "Watson, the candle, if you please." I brought him the stub of candle from the dressing table, and he turned it over twice in his fingers, before setting it down again, with peculiar care, as a man might set down something alive. "Burned unevenly," he said. "See here, the wax has guttered heavily to the one side, and yet the wick shows no sign of having been in a draught. A candle does not gutter so without air moving across it, Watson, and yet by your own testing, that window has not been opened in a decade." "A door, then," said I, "opened and closed quickly." "The door was bolted," said Fairweather, a little sharply, "from the inside, as I have told you twice now." "You have," Holmes agreed, in a tone that somehow managed to be entirely without offence and entirely without concession, both at once. He rose, brushing the knees of his trousers, and crossed to the dressing table, where he lifted, between finger and thumb, a single object so small that I had entirely overlooked it. A hairpin, plain, ordinary, lying a good 3 feet from the table itself, upon the bare floorboards near the wardrobe. "A hairpin does not walk, Mr. Fairweather," said he, holding it up so that it caught the last of the firelight. "It is dropped, or it is thrown, or it is lost in some manner of haste. Was your daughter given to carelessness with her toilette?" "Never." The word came out flat and immediate, and there was something almost wounded in the way he said it, as though the suggestion offended a truth he held dear about his daughter. "Eleanor was the most careful, the most orderly girl in London, Mr. Holmes. She kept her own accounts since she was 12 years old. She would never—" He broke off again, and this time did not finish the sentence at all. Holmes said nothing to this, only slipped the hairpin into his waistcoat pocket, with the particular gentleness of a man handling evidence he does not yet understand, but already respects. He moved next to the bed, and there, for the first time that night, I saw something shift in his expression. Not alarm, precisely, for I had rarely known Holmes to feel anything so simple as alarm, but a kind of sharpened attention, the look of a hound that has caught, faint and far off, the first thread of a scent. "The linens," said he. I looked, and saw nothing remarkable. The turned-down sheet, the smooth pillow, the coverlet folded back with what seemed to me perfectly ordinary neatness. "They are undisturbed," said Holmes. "Entirely undisturbed. No one lay down in that bed tonight, Mr. Fairweather, and no one sat upon its edge, and no one so much as leaned against its pillow. And yet the bolt was thrown at, you said, 3 hours before you broke down the door." "As near as I can reckon, yes." "Then your daughter spent some portion of 3 hours alone in this room, with the door secured and the window sealed, and never once approached her own bed." Holmes straightened and looked slowly about the chamber once more, from hearth to wardrobe to window to door, as a man might look about a stage after the players have gone, searching the empty boards for some trace of the performance that had passed there. "That, Mr. Fairweather, I confess I find a good deal stranger than the mere fact of her absence." There was a silence then, filled only by the settling of the coals in the grate, and, very far off, the rattle of the rain against the glass. "Is she dead, Mr. Holmes?" Fairweather's voice, when it came, was very small, very quiet, entirely unlike the desperate, hammering thing that had burst into our rooms on Baker Street not an hour before. "Tell me plainly. I am an old man, and my heart can bear the truth better than the waiting." Holmes turned to face him, and there was, in that moment, a gentleness in his manner that those who know him only by reputation would scarcely credit, for Holmes could be cold, and could be cutting, and could be as indifferent to the ordinary comforts of feeling as any man I have known, and yet there were moments, rare and always unexpected, when some deep well of true kindness rose up in him entirely unbidden. "I will tell you what I believe, which is not yet the truth, but may lead us to it," said he. "I do not believe your daughter is dead, Mr. Fairweather. A room does not arrange itself so carefully around a tragedy. Whatever has happened here tonight was neither swift nor violent. It was planned and prepared for and carried out with a steadiness of hand that speaks of intention rather than terror. Then, where is she?" Holmes looked once more toward the hearth, where the last coals were sinking slowly into ash, and when he spoke again, it was as much to himself, I think, as to any of us in that room. "That, Mr. Fairweather," said he softly, "is precisely what we are going to find out." He crouched then at the windowsill, silent, running one finger along the old, unbroken paint with an attention so total that the rest of us, Fairweather, myself, even the ordinary sounds of the sleeping house below, seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only Holmes and the sill and whatever secret it was that he alone, in that whole grieving household, seemed able to hear. Chapter 2. The Bride Who Almost Wasn't. We did not sleep that night, Holmes and I, though the household eventually did, in the exhausted, fitful way that grief permits when it has run itself past the point of feeling anything at all. Fairweather saw us to a small sitting room on the second floor, lit a fresh fire with his own hands rather than wake a servant a second time, and left us, at Holmes's quiet suggestion, to our thoughts until the household could be properly assembled and questioned in the grey light of morning. I confess, I found little rest in the hours that followed, even seated as I was in a comfortable chair with the fire built up warm before me. Holmes, for his part, did not attempt rest at all. He sat with his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon some point in the middle distance, and did not speak above a dozen words until the first pale suggestion of dawn had begun to soften the fog beyond the curtains. It was Edmund Carraway, the groom, who came to us first, some time after 8, his face composed into the particular smoothness of a man who has spent the whole night rehearsing his own grief and has not quite managed to make it look natural. He was a striking young man, I will grant him that. Tall, dark-haired, with the confident bearing of one who has argued cases before hard-eyed juries, and has learned to let nothing show upon his face that he does not intend to be seen. He offered his hand to Holmes, expressed, in careful and well-ordered sentences, his devastation at the night's events, and seated himself with the easy grace of a man settling in for a difficult but manageable interview. "I understand you were not in the house last night, Mr. Carraway," said Holmes, when the pleasantries had run their course. "I was not. It is considered bad luck, Mr. Holmes, for the groom to see the bride on the eve of the wedding. I dined with my own family and retired early. My man will confirm it, and my mother besides. A charming superstition, and a convenient one." Holmes said this lightly, almost pleasantly, and yet I saw Carraway's jaw tighten very slightly at the word convenient. "You have known Miss Fairweather how long?" "A year and some months. We met at a subscription concert. I will confess, I was quite taken with her at once. She had none of the affectation one finds in so many young women of society, Mr. Holmes. She was quiet, thoughtful. She listened more than she spoke, and I have always found that a rare and admirable quality. And you loved her, desperately. The word came quickly, perhaps too quickly, and Carraway seemed to hear this himself, for he softened his tone at once. "I love her still, Mr. Holmes. Whatever has become of her, I do not know what to think. I do not know where to begin thinking." Holmes let a silence stretch a moment before his next question. In that way, he had of allowing a man's own quiet to work upon him. "Might I ask, Mr. Carraway, the cufflinks you wear this morning? A handsome pair. Sapphire, I think, set in silver." Carraway glanced down at his own wrists with the faint puzzlement of a man asked to account for something he has never once considered. "A gift from my mother, upon my call to the bar. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Holmes, in a tone that told me, though it evidently did not tell Carraway, that there was every reason in the world. "Only that they differ from the pair you wore in your engagement portrait, which I noticed hangs in the front hall, plain gold, if my memory serves, and rather older in style. A man does not generally replace so personal a gift within the span of a single engagement, unless the first pair were lost, or given away, or—" He let the sentence hang there, unfinished, watching Carraway's face with the mild, unthreatening attention of a man remarking upon the weather. There was the smallest pause before Carraway answered. No more than half a second, I should think, and I doubt I should have marked it at all had I not spent so many years learning to watch for precisely such pauses in the company of Sherlock Holmes. "The gold pair was stolen," said Carraway at last, "from my chambers, some months past. A trifling loss. I did not think it worth mentioning to Eleanor, and I certainly do not see what bearing it has upon her disappearance." "Very probably none at all," said Holmes pleasantly, and turned the conversation elsewhere, though I noted, as I always noted, in those years beside him, that he had a way of setting aside a thread without ever truly letting it go. We spoke with Carraway a while longer, and learned little more of substance, save that he described Eleanor in the careful, admiring, slightly distant terms of a man describing a portrait rather than a woman he had held in his arms. Quiet, thoughtful, devoted to her father, fond of long walks and longer silences. He left us with fresh assurances of his devastation and his eagerness to assist however he might, and Holmes watched him go with an expression I had learned, over the years, to recognize as deep and careful thought disguised as idle interest. "A man in love does not choose his words so precisely, Watson," said he, once the door had closed. "Grief makes us clumsy. It was the clumsiness that was missing from that performance, not the grief. It was from the household staff and from an elderly aunt of Fairweather's, roused reluctantly from her bed to be questioned over a hurried breakfast, that we began at last to build some portrait of Eleanor Fairweather herself. For it struck me, even then, how strange it was that in a house so thoroughly upended by her absence, no one seemed quite able to describe the girl who had vanished from it, except through the recollections of others. She was 23. Her mother had died when she was young, and she had been raised largely by a governess, a Miss Prynne, long since retired to the country, whose photograph still stood upon the mantel of Eleanor's own sitting room downstairs. She was quiet, as Carraway had said, and orderly, as her father had insisted, and, this from the aunt, delivered with a certain pursed disapproval, she had, some years before, entertained a suitor of whom the family had not approved. "A sailor," said the aunt, with the particular distaste some women reserve for professions that smell of salt water and adventure. "A Mr. Rourke, Thomas Rourke, no family to speak of, no prospects, and forever away at sea for months at a stretch. Josiah put a stop to it, quite rightly, and the young man was lost not long after. His ship went down somewhere off the Cape, I believe, some 2 years past. A sad business, but a merciful one, if I may say so. It spared us a great deal of unpleasantness." 2:14. "Did Miss Fairweather grieve him?" Holmes asked. The aunt considered this with the air of a woman deciding how much truth a question truly deserved. She did not speak of it, but then, Eleanor rarely spoke of anything that troubled her. It was not her way. There was one further detail, offered almost as an afterthought by a young housemaid too tired and too frightened to guard her words as carefully as the family had guarded theirs, that Eleanor had, some months before, received a single visit from a woman calling herself an aunt on her late mother's side, a Mrs. Vane, who had come once, taken tea alone with Eleanor for the better part of an afternoon, and had never called again, nor been mentioned by any other member of the household since. "I did think it queer," the girl admitted, twisting her apron in her hands. "Miss Fairweather never once spoke of her afterward, not to her father, not to anyone, and when I asked her, only the once, mind, who the lady had been, she only said, 'An old friend of my mother's, from a life before this one,' and would say no more." Holmes wrote nothing of this down, for he never did, trusting entirely to that vast and orderly storehouse of a memory he carried behind his grey eyes. But I saw him turn the detail over as a man turns a coin, testing its weight, before he thanked the girl and let her go. It was near midday before we found ourselves alone again, seated by the fire in the small sitting room, with a fresh pot of tea between us, and it was there, in that brief, quiet interval, that Holmes laid out for me, as he so loved to do, and as I so loved to hear, the shape of the puzzle as it then stood. "We have, Watson, 3 threads, and I do not yet know which of them, if any, leads to the centre of this business. We have a groom who does not grieve quite as a man ought, and who has replaced a gift from his own mother without troubling to mention why. We have a dead sailor, conveniently dead, whom the family was glad to see off to the bottom of the sea. And we have a mysterious aunt who called once, spoke to Eleanor alone, and vanished from the family's memory as thoroughly as Eleanor herself has now vanished from that locked room upstairs. You think one of these connects to her disappearance? I think it very likely that all 3 do, in ways we cannot yet perceive," said Holmes, warming his hands about his cup. "A woman does not vanish from a bolted room on the eve of her wedding for no reason at all, Watson. There is always a reason. The difficulty, as ever, lies not in whether a reason exists, but in persuading it to show itself to us before the trail grows cold." He fell silent then, gazing into the fire with that particular stillness I had come to know so well, and outside, the fog pressed close against the windows, and somewhere below us, a household went on grieving a girl who might, for all any of us then knew, be perfectly alive and perfectly safe, somewhere out there in the vast indifferent city, or might not be at all. 15. Interlude. The governess's account. It was Holmes's suggestion, made almost idly over the last of the tea, that we might learn more of Eleanor Fairweather from the woman who had raised her than from any member of the household still living beneath her father's roof. And so it was that the following morning found us upon a slow, rattling train bound out of London, through suburbs that thinned by degrees into bare autumn fields, toward the small village of Ashcombe, where Miss Prynne, Eleanor's governess for the better part of 15 years, had retired some 3 years before to a cottage of her own choosing. I remember that journey chiefly for its quiet, a rare and welcome thing after the frantic hours that had preceded it. Holmes sat with his eyes closed for the greater part of it, and I watched the fields go by, bare and brown and touched with the first frost of the season, and found myself, for the first time since that midnight knock upon our door, able to think of the case not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a story about a young woman I had never met and had already, in some strange way, come to feel a great deal for. Miss Prynne received us in a small, low-ceilinged sitting room, crowded with books and dried flowers, a woman well past 60, upright and clear-eyed, with the particular unhurried composure of a person who has spent her whole life teaching patience to others, and has, along the way, thoroughly learned it herself. She had heard nothing yet of Eleanor's disappearance. and I watched Holmes deliver the news with a gentleness that surprised me less each time I witnessed it, for I had, by then, seen him extend such careful kindness to a good many frightened and grieving people in the course of our work together. 16. I am not entirely astonished, said Miss Prynne, when Holmes had finished, her hands folded very still in her lap. I will confess that to you plainly, gentlemen, though I would not have said it to her father. Eleanor was never a girl who wore her heart upon her sleeve, but she was, beneath that quiet surface, one of the most determined young women it has ever been my privilege to teach. She decided things, gentlemen, slowly and thoroughly, and once decided, she did not waver from them. Not out of stubbornness, mind, but out of a kind of deep and careful loyalty to her own conclusions. Once she had satisfied herself, they were sound. You taught her from childhood, said Holmes, from the age of 6, when her poor mother died, until she was 21 and considered too old, by her father's reckoning, for a governess any longer. I taught her her letters and her sums and her French, and I like to think I taught her a good deal else besides that never found its way into any lesson book, how to sit with grief without letting it master her, chiefly, for she had a great deal of grief to sit with, losing her mother so young, and gaining, in her place, only a father who loved her dearly, but showed it, I fear, chiefly through the careful management of her future, rather than the warmer comforts of the present. Did she ever speak to you of Thomas Rourke? I asked, for I confess the question had been sitting with me the whole journey down. Something softened in Miss Prynne's face at the name, not surprise, I noticed, but a kind of gentle, long-held recognition. Once, and only once, some 2 years past, not long after the news came of his ship's loss, she came to me here, unannounced, and sat in that very chair you occupy now, Doctor, and wept for the better part of an hour without once explaining why, and I did not ask her to, for I understood well enough. I had watched that particular attachment grow between them years before, when he was still a young man delivering wool samples for his uncle's shipping concern, and I had watched her father end it as thoroughly and as kindly as such things are ever ended, which is to say, not kindly at all, whatever the intention behind it. You believe she loved him still, even then? I believe, Mr. Holmes, that Eleanor Fairweather was not a young woman who loved lightly, nor let go of what she had once decided to love, simply because circumstance demanded it of her. I do not know what has become of her, and I will own to you honestly that I am frightened for her, hearing your news today. But if you ask me whether I believe her capable of some quiet, determined act that the rest of the world might call reckless, and that I would call, instead, entirely in keeping with the girl I raised, then yes, gentlemen, I believe that entirely. She was always the sort to build her own doors, when the ones given to her would not open. We took our leave of Miss Prynne a while later, with the promise, which Holmes kept faithfully, to send word once the matter was resolved, and it was on the slow train back toward London, the light already beginning to fail over those same bare, frost-touched fields, that Holmes spoke the only words of that whole quiet journey. "You see it now too, Watson, I think," said he softly, watching the darkening countryside slide past the window. "We are not chasing a victim. We never were. We are chasing a young woman who has spent her whole life building doors, quietly and patiently, against the day she might finally need to use one. And I begin to suspect, my friend, that the day has very nearly come." 17, Chapter 3. The Locksmith's Testimony. Before I go further, friends, let me pause a moment, not in the story, but with you. If you are still here, still listening, with the lamp turned low and the world outside gone quiet, I wonder if you might do one small thing for me before you drift any further into this tale. Reach up, just for a moment, and touch that little bell, the subscribe button if this is your first evening with us, so that Watson's Journal is waiting for you again tomorrow night. I ask for nothing else, no address, no obligation, only that small kindness, and then I promise to trouble you no further, and we shall return at once to Baker Street, and to Fog, and to the business of Eleanor Fairweather. Now, where were we? It was Holmes's habit, in the early stages of any investigation, to attend first to the small and overlooked figures of a household's life. Not the family, who are always the most rehearsed in their answers, but the tradesmen, the servants, the quiet functionaries who pass through a house's history, leaving small, honest marks that no one thinks to polish away. And so it was that, on the afternoon following that long and sleepless night, we found ourselves not in some drawing room of quality, but in the cramped, oil-smelling workshop of one Mr. Aldous Penny, locksmith, of Cable Street. He was a small, round man with the permanently squinting eyes of one who has spent 40 years peering into the workings of other people's locks, and he greeted Holmes's questions with the wary courtesy of a man who has learned that questions about locks are rarely asked for pleasant reasons. "The Fairweather bolt," said he, when Holmes had explained his business, wiping his hands upon a leather apron already black with old oil. "Aye, I know the one. Installed it myself, 6 months back, near enough." At Mr. Fairweather's instruction. "No, sir." Penny said this with the particular emphasis of a man correcting an assumption he had heard before and found tiresome. "It was the young lady herself who came to me, Miss Fairweather. Came alone, if you'll credit it. No maid nor chaperone with her, which struck me as unusual for a house of that standing. But she paid in good coin and asked good questions, and it was none of my business to inquire further." "What manner of questions?" Holmes asked, and I noticed a new sharpness had entered his voice, quiet though it remained. 18. She wanted to know, could a bolt be thrown from outside a room as well as from within? Not by any ordinary means, mind, but by some manner of thread or wire, run beneath the door and looped about the bolt's own handle, so that a person standing in the corridor might draw it shut behind them and leave no trace of having done so. Penny scratched at his grizzled chin. I told her it could be done, with the right bolt fitted proper for the purpose, a smooth-running mechanism, well-oiled, no catch nor snag to it. She asked me to fit her just such a one, and I did, and thought no more of it, save that it was an odd request from an odd sort of customer, though a paying one, and paying customers, sir, are not so thick on the ground in this trade that a man can afford to turn away the odd ones along with the rude ones. I felt, rather than saw, Holmes go very still beside me. "You are telling me," said he slowly, "that the very bolt which secured that room from within, and which her father broke down believing his daughter locked inside it, could equally well have been thrown from the passage outside, by any hand skilled enough to manage a length of wire and a steady nerve?" "That is precisely what I am telling you, sir, yes." "And did Miss Fairweather say why she wished such a mechanism fitted?" Penny shook his head slowly. "She did not, and I did not ask. A young lady wanting privacy in her own bedchamber is no great mystery, Mr. Holmes, whatever else may be. I fitted the bolt, took my payment, and went about my business." We left the little workshop a short while later, out into a Cable Street thick with the smell of the river and the low autumn sun struggling weakly through a haze that was not quite fog and not quite smoke, but some grey compromise of London's own particular devising. Holmes walked in silence for some minutes, his stick tapping an even, thoughtful rhythm against the cobbles. "You see the shape of it beginning to change, Watson," said he at last. "We came to this house believing we sought a mystery of ingress. How did some person or persons enter a sealed room and remove a young woman from it against her will? But if that bolt could be thrown from without as easily as within, then we are no longer asking how anyone got in. We are asking how and why Eleanor Fairweather arranged, with her own hand and her own coin, to make it appear that she never could have left." "You believe she engineered her own disappearance?" "I believe it grows steadily more difficult to believe otherwise," said Holmes. "Though I would remind you, Watson, that a woman may arrange the means of her own escape and still be taken against her will by some third party who discovered and made use of that very means. We are not yet at the end of this thread. We are, I think, only just beginning to see where it leads. 19. It was upon our return to the house that evening, in the grey hour before the lamps were lit, that we came upon the second thread of that day's unravelling, a small, frightened housemaid named Bridget, no more than 17, who had been too shy or too afraid to speak freely before the whole assembled household that morning, but who came to Holmes now of her own accord, wringing her apron between reddened hands in the empty hush of the servants' passage. "I ought to have said, sir, when you asked before, only I didn't like to, not with the master standing right there listening," said she, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's been sitting on me something terrible, and I thought perhaps if I told you quiet, like, it needn't go further than needs be." "Tell me now then, quietly, and I promise you it shall go no further than it must," said Holmes, and there was a gentleness in his manner with the girl that I had seen him use before with frightened witnesses, and which never failed, in my long experience of it, to work upon them far more effectively than any sternness could have done. "It was singing, sir. Last night, the night Miss Eleanor went, I was passing by her door, near on midnight it must have been, carrying up a warming pan for her, only I heard voices. No, not voices, just the one voice, hers, I'm certain of it. And it was singing, sir. Very soft, very low, like a lullaby, near enough, only I couldn't make out the words of it, and I've turned it over and over in my mind since, and I don't believe they were English words at all, some other tongue entirely. I stood a good minute listening, sir, I'll not deny it, and then I lost my nerve and set the warming pan down outside the door and went away again, for it didn't feel—" She stopped, searching for the word. "It didn't feel like a thing I ought to be listening to, sir. Not like eavesdropping on gossip. It felt like listening in on something private. Something meant only for her. And you are certain it was her own voice, and not some other, come to visit her in secret. I couldn't swear to it in a court of law, sir, but in my own heart, I'd stake my place in this house that it was hers, and hers alone. There weren't no second voice answering, nor no sound of another person moving about in there. Just her, singing soft to herself, in words I never heard before nor since." Holmes thanked the girl with a courtesy that sent her away, I think, a good deal less troubled than she had come, and when she had gone, he stood a long moment in that dim passage, quite motionless, before he spoke again. "A lullaby, Watson, sung alone, in a room a young woman has fitted with a bolt that may be thrown from without. On the very eve of a wedding she was, by every outward appearance, prepared calmly to attend." He turned to me, and in the fading light I saw something in his face that was not quite excitement and not quite unease, but some quieter cousin of both. "I begin to suspect, my friend, that we are not chasing a crime committed against Eleanor Fairweather at all. I begin to suspect we are chasing a secret she has kept, and kept well, for a very great deal longer than any of us yet understand." 20. Chapter 4. A Ledger and a Lie. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house of business once its books have been opened to a stranger's eye, and it was that quiet which met us the following morning, when Holmes, through means he did not trouble to explain to me, though I suspected they involved a discreet word with a clerk at Fairweather's counting house, obtained sight of the wool merchant's private ledgers. We sat together in our rooms at Baker Street, the fire built up against a morning that had turned bitter and clear, the fog for once burned away by a hard, pale sun, and Holmes turned the pages of that ledger with the same unhurried, total attention he might have given to a rare manuscript. "Debt, Watson," said he, after a long while, "and not the ordinary, survivable debt of a merchant weathering a poor season. This is the deeper sort, the sort that eats a business slowly from within, until one morning the whole structure gives way at once, and everyone is astonished, though the truth was there in the numbers for anyone with the patience to read them. How deep? Deep enough that Josiah Fairweather stands, at this moment, perhaps 4 months from ruin. Deep enough, I should think, that a marriage between his daughter and the son of a prosperous barrister's family would answer his difficulties very neatly indeed. For I have made inquiries, Watson, and the Carraway family, whatever else it may be, is not a family troubled by want. I sat back in my chair, feeling the shape of the case shift once more beneath us, as it had shifted twice already in as many days. Then Eleanor's marriage was not a matter of the heart at all. It was a matter of her father's survival. It may have been both, or it may have been neither, from her own point of view, said Holmes, closing the ledger with care. That is the difficulty with the human heart, Watson. It rarely announces its true business to an outside observer, and a daughter who loved her father dearly might consent to a marriage that saved him and call it love besides, and perhaps even believe it for a time. But if that daughter later discovered a reason why she could not go through with it, a reason older and dearer and less easily set aside, then a young woman raised to be obedient and orderly and careful of her father's feelings might find herself with only one honourable course remaining to her, to vanish so completely and so mysteriously that no blame could ever attach itself to her father's household, nor to his standing, nor to the marriage he so desperately required. 21. You are suggesting she fled, Holmes. Not that she was taken. I am suggesting it is now the more probable of the two. He rose and crossed to the window, looking down upon Baker Street, where a coal cart rattled past through the thin morning light. And yet, Watson, there remains a difficulty in that theory, which I confess troubles me a good deal more than the ledger, or the lullaby, or the mysterious Mrs. Vane put together. The locked door. Precisely the locked door. We have established that the bolt might be thrown from without, by any hand with a length of wire and a steady nerve. But no one saw Eleanor Fairweather leave that room, Watson. Not by the door, which was witnessed bolted from the passage side within the hour of her vanishing, and certainly not by the window, which I intend to examine again this very afternoon, with rather more care than I gave it in the confusion of that first exhausted night. We returned to the house before noon, and Holmes went at once to the bridal chamber, now cold and untouched, the fire long since gone to ash, the wedding gown still hanging upon the wardrobe door like something waiting, with infinite patience, for an occupant who would never now come to claim it. I confess the sight of it struck me with a fresh sadness each time I saw it, and I wondered, not for the first time, what manner of courage or desperation it must take for a woman to leave such a thing behind, unworn, upon the eve of the day it was made for. Holmes went directly to the window, and this time he did not merely test the sash with his hand, as he had done that first exhausted night. He drew from his pocket the small folding glass he carried always about him, knelt upon the floorboards despite the cold, and examined the latch itself with an attention so close and so silent that I did not disturb him for the better part of 10 minutes. "Watson," said he at last, and there was a note in his voice that brought me at once to his side. "Look here. What do you make of this?" I bent and peered through the glass where he held it, at the small brass latch that secured the window's upper sash, and saw, faint but unmistakable in the raking morning light, a series of fine, parallel scratches worked into the old paint about its edge. Scratches too regular, too deliberate, to have come from ordinary wear. "Someone has worked at this latch," said I slowly, "and recently." "Someone has done a good deal more than worked at it," said Holmes, rising and dusting the knees of his trousers. "Observe the direction of the scratches, Watson. They run from without inward, not the reverse. This latch was disturbed, and disturbed with some care, from outside the window, not from within the room. Which is to say that our earlier assumption, that this window has stood painted shut and undisturbed these 10 years, was, I fear, entirely mistaken. It has been opened, Watson, opened and later relatched by a hand working from some position beyond the glass itself. I confess I looked at him then in some bewilderment, for we stood, as I have said, upon the third floor of the house, with nothing beyond that window but a sheer drop to a narrow paved court below. Holmes, there is no ledge, no balcony, no tree near enough to serve a purpose. How could any hand have reached that latch from without, unless it belonged to some manner of bird? "That, my dear Watson," said Holmes, and I saw, for the first time since that midnight knock upon our door, something almost like satisfaction flicker across his features, "is an excellent question, and I begin to suspect that its answer lies not outside this house at all, but somewhere within it, in some passage, or stair, or forgotten corner that this family has long since ceased to think of as a way through their own walls." He turned from the window and looked about the room once more, at the wardrobe, at the hearth, at the pale, empty gown hanging patient in the gathering dusk, with the particular expression of a man who has begun, at last, to suspect the true shape of the maze he is walking, even if he cannot yet see its center. "We have been asking the wrong question from the start, Watson," said he quietly. "We have been asking how Eleanor Fairweather left this room. I begin to think we ought instead to be asking whether she ever truly needed to use that door, or that window, at all." Interlude. Inspector Morton's report. It was Holmes's habit, in cases touching upon a possible crime, to keep the official force informed of the barest necessary facts, whatever private theories he might be pursuing beyond their reach. And so it was that we called that same afternoon upon Inspector Morton at his cramped, paper-crowded office off the Embankment, the same Morton who had passed us that first foggy night, standing at the corner of Baker Street with his collar turned up against the rain, and whose singular expression, upon hearing of Holmes's illness, I had, at the time, thought nothing more than the ordinary curiosity of a passing acquaintance. He greeted us now with the weary courtesy of a man who has learned, over a long career, that Sherlock Holmes rarely brings news that simplifies his workload. "No ransom note, you say, and no sign of forced entry beyond a window some 10 years painted shut," said Morton, turning over the thin file that had already begun to gather concerning the Fairweather case, more from the family's frantic inquiries than from any real progress of his own department. "I'll not pretend I'm sorry to hear it, Mr. Holmes, for a young lady vanished from a locked room with no mark of violence about her is a good deal less troubling to my superiors than a young lady vanished with blood on the floorboards. But I'll own I don't much like a case with no shape to it at all. Give me a burglar, or a jealous suitor, or even a body, and I know what drawer to file it in. This," he gestured at the thin file with evident distaste, "this I don't know what to do with." "You may find, Inspector, that the shape of this case is a good deal gentler than either of us first supposed," said Holmes carefully, for I could see he had no wish to mislead the man outright, nor yet to hand him a thread that might, if pulled by official hands, unravel rather more of Eleanor Fairweather's future than her own conscience required to be unravelled. "I do not believe foul play has occurred here, Inspector, and I would ask that your department hold its inquiries lightly for a few days more, while I pursue certain lines of my own. I will bring you whatever the law genuinely requires to know, the moment I am satisfied of it." Morton regarded him with the particular squinting skepticism of a policeman who has worked alongside Sherlock Holmes often enough to know that such requests were rarely refused, and rarely regretted either, whatever grumbling they provoked in the meantime. "You'll forgive me if I hold you to that, Mr. Holmes. I've a superintendent who likes his files closed tidy, with an arrest at the bottom of them, if one can be managed, and precious little patience for cases that simply stop, with no one brought before a magistrate at the end of it." He closed the thin file with a resigned sigh. "But I'll grant you your few days, seeing as it's you asking, and seeing as I've yet to regret trusting your instinct in a case, however queer it looked at the outset. One further question, Inspector, if I may," said Holmes, as we rose to take our leave. The night we first met upon Baker Street, in the rain, you asked after my health with a curiosity I confess struck me as somewhat particular for a man who had not seen me above twice in as many years. Might I ask what prompted it? Morton's weathered face coloured very slightly, and he busied himself a moment with the papers on his desk before answering. No great mystery to it, Mr. Holmes, only that I'd heard, through the usual channels, a rumour you'd taken seriously ill some days past. A tropical fever, the story went, caught in the course of some investigation down among the docks. I'd wondered, seeing you looking hale as ever that night, whether the rumour had been exaggerated, or whether I'd simply mistaken the man it concerned. Holmes was very still a moment, and something passed behind his grey eyes that I did not, at the time, fully understand, though I have wondered since whether some private memory of his own, some case he never fully shared with me, nor with this journal, had briefly surfaced and as briefly submerged again beneath the more pressing business of the hour. "A rumour only, Inspector, and a mistaken one," said he at last, with a faint, unreadable smile. "I assure you I am in excellent health. Good afternoon to you, and my thanks for your patience with this stranger sort of case than you are accustomed to." We left the inspector to his paperwork and stepped back out into an embankment thick once more, with the particular grey chill of a London afternoon fading early toward evening, and Holmes walked some distance in silence before he spoke again, in a tone rather lighter than the one he had used within Morton's office. "A small mystery within a larger one, Watson, and not one I intend to trouble either of us with tonight," said he. "Come, it grows late, and I believe we have an apothecary on Wentworth Street who may yet tell us a good deal more about a woman named Vane than any official file in that building behind us ever could." Chapter 5. The Widow of Wentworth Street. The trail of Mrs. Vane, that mysterious aunt who had called once upon Eleanor Fairweather and never been seen or spoken of again, led us, over the course of that long afternoon, through a London that grew steadily older and stranger with every street we crossed, away from the clean, prosperous respectability of the Fairweather house, and down toward the older bones of the city, where buildings leaned close together over narrow lanes as though sharing some ancient confidence, and where the fog, even in daylight, seemed to gather thicker and settle lower than anywhere else I had known. No directory listed a Mrs. Vane, no parish register that Holmes could discover through his usual quiet channels recorded any woman of that name connected by marriage or blood to the Fairweather family. It was, in the end, an old apothecary on Wentworth Street, a stooped, soft-spoken man named Croft, whose shop smelled of dried herbs and camphor, and something older and mustier beneath both, who gave us, almost by accident, the thread we needed. Holmes had described the woman as best he could from the housemaid's account, a lady of middle years, dark-clothed, quiet-spoken, with a particular grave courtesy in her manner, and Croft had listened with his head tilted, weighing the description with the care of a man accustomed to matching faces to symptoms. "You'll be meaning Mrs. Agatha Vane," said he at last, "though I'll wager she's given that family some other name, or none at all. She's known in these parts, sir, if known is quite the word for it. Spoken of, more truly, in the manner one speaks of a thing one has heard tell of, but never quite met square on." "What is her trade?" Holmes asked. Croft glanced toward his shop door, as though he half expected someone to be listening at it, and lowered his voice a further degree. "Morning theatre, sir, is the politest name for it. There's them in this city, more than fine folk like to credit, who hire out women such as Mrs. Vane for funerals, where the grief runs thin and needs bolstering before the neighbours. Professional mourners, sir, weepers, criers, and Mrs. Vane the finest of the trade, or so I'm told, for she does more than weep. She stages, she arranges, she has, I've heard it said, built more than one false wall, and more than one hidden stair, for gentlefolk wanting to work some manner of spirit show at a funeral, or a séance. or some other theatre of the departed, to comfort the bereaved or fleece them, depending on the honesty of the household that hires her. He shook his head slowly. It's a strange trade, sir, and I'll not pretend to understand the appetite for it. But there's money in grief, same as there's money in most everything else, and Mrs. Vane has made a fair living of it these 20 years and more. Holmes was very still for a long moment after this, and I saw, in the particular set of his shoulders, that some great piece of the puzzle had just slid, with an almost audible click, into its proper place. "Watson," said he, once we had thanked the apothecary and stepped back out into the thickening dusk of Wentworth Street, "do you recall the age of the Fairweather house? The manner in which Fairweather himself spoke of it that first night?" I confessed I did not particularly recall any such detail, my attention that night having been rather more fully occupied by the empty room itself than by the history of the building that contained it. He called it a coaching inn once, in passing, before he corrected himself and called it merely an old house. A slip of the tongue. I thought nothing of it at the time, but I think a great deal of it now. A coaching inn, Watson, of the sort that stood along the old roads before the railways swept such places into obsolescence, was very often built with passages meant for purposes its later, more respectable owners would never think to look for. Servants' stairs hidden behind panelling, so that a household might be attended upon without the gentry ever glimpsing so much as the hem of a maid's skirt. Smugglers' cavities, in the older and less scrupulous establishments, built to hide goods, or persons, from the eyes of the excisemen. If the Fairweather house was once such an inn, converted a generation or two ago into a private residence, then it is entirely possible, I should say now, entirely probable, that some portion of its original structure survives, forgotten, behind the walls that its current family believes to be solid. And you believe Mrs. Vane knew of such a passage, that she built it, or found it, or restored it, in her professional capacity, and that Eleanor engaged her services to make use of it. I believe it is time we returned to that house, Watson, and searched it properly, not as grieving visitors picking through the wreckage of a family's sorrow, but as men who suspect, at last, precisely what sort of wreckage they are looking for. We returned to the Fairweather house as the last light was failing, and Holmes requested, gently, but with an insistence that brooked no true refusal, that the household be sent early to their rooms, that we might conduct our search undisturbed. Fairweather himself, worn thin by 2 days without proper sleep, agreed with the weary compliance of a man who has stopped believing he understands anything at all about his own home, and by 9 o'clock the house had settled into that particular hush that comes only very late, or very early, when even the servants' quarters have gone quiet. I will not soon forget that search, friends, if you will permit me the indulgence of the memory a moment longer. There is something in the business of searching a familiar house by candlelight, tapping gently along wainscoting that has stood unquestioned for decades, that turns the most ordinary of homes into something strange and watchful, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see whether their old secrets would be found out at last. We began in the bridal chamber itself, working outward from the wardrobe that stood against the room's north wall, the same wardrobe upon which Eleanor's wedding gown yet hung, pale and patient in the candlelight. Holmes tapped along its back panel with the handle of his stick, his ear pressed close, moving with infinite patience from one board to the next, while I held the candle steady and tried, not entirely successfully, to keep my own nerves from fraying at every settling creak of that old house around us. It was perhaps the 4th panel he tried that gave back, beneath his knuckles, a sound distinctly different from its neighbours, not the dull, solid knock of wood against brick, but a faint, hollow resonance, as of wood against empty air. "Here, Watson," he said softly, and I brought the candle closer, my heart, I confess, beating rather faster than I should have liked to admit. Chapter 6. The Hidden Room. The panel gave way at Holmes's insistence with a low groan of old, dry hinges that had not turned in a very long while, swinging inward to reveal not the solid brick I had half expected, but a narrow gap of true darkness. A stairway, steep and close, descending between the outer wall of the house and some inner partition that must, I realized, have stood unsuspected behind that wardrobe for the better part of a century. "A servant's stair," Holmes murmured, holding his own candle forward into that darkness. "Or something older still. Mind your head, Watson, and your footing besides. These boards have not borne weight in a very long while, I should think, and I have no great wish to explain to Mr. Fairweather how we came to add a second calamity to his household in as many days." We descended slowly, the candlelight throwing our shadows huge and wavering against walls of old unpainted brick, the air growing steadily colder and closer as we went, thick with the particular smell of enclosed places long undisturbed, dust and damp stone, and something else beneath it, faint but unmistakable, that I recognized a moment before Holmes named it aloud. "Lavender," said he softly, "the same scent we noted upon the dressing table above. Someone has passed this way, Watson, and not so very long ago." The stair ended, after perhaps a dozen steps, in a low, narrow chamber, scarcely larger than a modest closet, its walls of the same old brick, its ceiling so low that Holmes was obliged to stoop within it. It had plainly once connected onward. I could see, at its far end, where a passage had been deliberately bricked up, the newer mortar pale and rough against the older stone around it. The work, I should have guessed, of some previous owner sealing away a piece of the building's history he had no further use for, and no doubt no notion of what it had once served to hide. And there, in the flickering candlelight, upon the dusty floor of that forgotten chamber, we found the first true, unmistakable trace of Eleanor Fairweather herself. A scrap of pale silk, torn free and left snagged upon a splinter of old wood, where the bricked-up passage met the wall. The same silk, unmistakably, as the wedding gown that yet hung, whole and untouched, upon the wardrobe 2 floors above, which told me at once that she had worn some other garment beneath it, or over it, on the night she vanished, and had caught and torn it in her passage through this narrow, forgotten place. And beside it, weighted beneath a loose fragment of brick, as though to prevent its being carried off by some draught, a single folded sheet of paper. Holmes lifted it with the particular delicacy he reserved for evidence he suspected might matter a very great deal, and unfolded it beneath the candle's light. I read it over his shoulder, and I confess that even now, so many years distant from that night, I can recall the exact hand in which it was written, small, careful, unhurried, the hand of a woman who had known precisely what she meant to say, and had taken the time to say it well, even in the last desperate hour of her old life. "Do not follow. I am not stolen. I am simply gone. Forgive me the manner of it. It was the only door I had that no one else could close against me. There was no signature. There needed to be none." We stood a long moment in that low, close chamber, the candlelight guttering faintly in some draught I could not place, and I confess that what I felt, in that moment, was not the satisfaction of a mystery half solved, but something nearer to a quiet, unexpected grief. For whatever had driven Eleanor Fairweather to carve out, in secret, over long and careful months, an escape from the very room built to celebrate the happiest day of her life, it could not, I thought, have been a small or a foolish thing. No woman does such careful, patient work for a whim. "She did not flee tonight in a panic, Watson," said Holmes at last, very quietly, turning the note over once more in his long fingers, as though it might yet yield some further secret. "Look at the steadiness of this hand. Look at the calm of these words. This was not written by a woman in terror, fleeing some sudden threat discovered at the last hour. This was written, I think, by a woman who had known for a very long time that this night would come, and had prepared herself for it as thoroughly as she had prepared this stair, and that bolt, and every other piece of the quiet architecture of her own disappearance. Then this was no rash flight. It was a plan laid months in advance. I should say longer than months, Watson. I should say this plan was laid from very nearly the moment her engagement to Mr. Carraway was first announced, perhaps before it. He held the candle a moment longer over the scrap of torn silk, and then rose, stooping beneath the low ceiling, and turned back toward the stair by which we had come. "We are no longer investigating an abduction, my friend. I do not believe we ever truly were, though I confess it took me rather longer than I should like to admit to see it plainly. We are investigating a woman's escape, planned, prepared, and executed with a patience and a nerve that I confess I find myself admiring a very great deal, whatever grief it has caused her poor father above." But escape from what, Holmes? A marriage she did not want? Surely there were gentler ways for an unwilling bride to withdraw from an engagement than to vanish through a hidden passage and leave her father believing her stolen or dead. Holmes paused upon the stair, his candle throwing strange, shifting shadows across the old brick walls around us, and when he answered, his voice had taken on a graver note than I had yet heard from him in the whole course of that strange investigation. "That, Watson, is precisely the question that troubles me most. A woman fleeing an unwanted marriage need only refuse it, however painful the scandal that follows. She does not require a hidden stair, nor a false bolt, nor the services of a professional deceiver skilled in vanishings. Such elaborate and secret preparation speaks not of a woman avoiding an unhappy match, but of a woman protecting someone, herself, perhaps, or another, from a danger she believed genuine enough to warrant this whole extraordinary architecture of concealment." He resumed his ascent, and I followed close behind, the candlelight bobbing between us in that narrow, dust-thick dark. "I begin to think, Watson, that we have been asking all along what Eleanor Fairweather was running from. I begin to suspect the truer question is who she believed would come looking for her, and what that person might do should they ever find her." We emerged at last back into the bridal chamber, drawing the wardrobe panel closed behind us, and stood a moment in the ordinary, candle-lit familiarity of that room, the cold hearth, the empty bed, the pale gown still hanging patient upon its hook, which seemed, after the close, secret dark of that hidden stair, almost unbearably sad in its stillness. "The sailor, Holmes," said I slowly, a thought forming even as I spoke it. "Thomas Rourke. You said his death was convenient for this family. What if it was rather more than convenient? What if it was arranged?" Holmes turned to me, and in the candlelight I saw, upon his sharp, tired features, the particular look he wore only when a case had just tilted, all at once, into some new and unexpected shape. Not triumph, precisely, but the quiet, fierce satisfaction of a hound that has finally caught, whole and unmistakable, the scent it has been circling for hours. "Watson," said he softly, "I begin to think you have hit upon it rather more quickly than I did myself. Let us go and ask Mrs. Agatha Vane, who deals so profitably in false deaths and hidden stairs, precisely how convincingly a young sailor's drowning may be arranged for a family desperate enough to pay her price." Chapter 7. The Sailor's Return. We found Mrs. Agatha Vane the following evening, in a narrow house off Wentworth Street that gave no outward sign of the peculiar trade conducted within it. A respectable brass knocker, clean curtains, a small brass plate bearing no name at all, only the words, "Private Consultations, by appointment." She received us in a sitting room hung with dark velvet drapery, thick even for that season, and lit so dimly by shaded lamps that I understood at once, and rather admired despite myself, the theatrical instinct that shaped even so small and unremarkable a room as this. She was, as the housemaid had described her, a woman of middle years, dark-clothed, quiet-voiced, with a grave and watchful composure that gave away nothing at all until Holmes chose, quite deliberately, to give it something to react to. "Mrs. Vane," said he, seating himself without invitation, in that particular manner he had of making any room feel, within moments, entirely his own. I have come to discuss Thomas Rourke's death, which I do not believe occurred, and Eleanor Fairweather's disappearance, which I believe you arranged down to its very last careful detail. The bolt that could be thrown from without, the hidden stair behind her wardrobe, and the false report of a young sailor's drowning some 2 years past. All of it the work of the same patient and considerable talent. I confess I expected some show of denial, some flare of indignation, and was rather taken aback when none came. Mrs. Vane regarded Holmes for a long moment in silence, her dark eyes moving over his face with an attention I recognized, uncomfortably, as very near to his own, the attention of one careful, watchful mind assessing another. "You have worked it out a good deal faster than most," said she at last, and there was, unmistakably, a note of grudging admiration in her voice. "I confess, I did not expect the family to call in anyone half so capable. I had rather hoped Josiah Fairweather would simply grieve his daughter as lost, report it to the police as a tragedy, and let the matter close itself within the month, as such matters generally do." "You do not deny it, then?" "I see very little profit in denying what a man of your evident ability has already proven to his own satisfaction, Mr. Holmes." She rose, crossed to a small cabinet, and poured, without asking, 2 glasses of a dark sherry, setting one before each of us with the unhurried courtesy of a woman entertaining welcome guests rather than the detectives come to unravel her work. "I will tell you what I told Eleanor Fairweather herself, the first afternoon she came to me, near a year ago now, white-faced and desperate and utterly certain that no one in her own family would ever believe the truth she carried. I told her that I do not deal in lies, Mr. Holmes. Whatever my trade may look like from the outside, I deal in mercy. There is a great deal of difference between the two, though I grant you, the world rarely troubles itself to learn it." "Perhaps you might begin," said Holmes, "with Thomas Rourke." Mrs. Vane settled back into her chair, and for the first time since we had entered that dim, velvet room, something in her composed features softened, not into guilt, I thought, but into something nearer to old and careful sorrow. "Thomas Rourke did not drown, Mr. Holmes. He was never even upon the ship whose loss the family was told to grieve. He left England 2 years ago, not because the sea claimed him, but because Josiah Fairweather made it very plain to the boy, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that a penniless sailor's continued presence in his daughter's life would end badly for the sailor, and worse for the daughter's prospects. I was engaged, through channels I need not trouble you with, to arrange a convincing report of his death, so that the matter might be closed cleanly, and the family's reputation preserved, and Eleanor herself, still very young then, spared the ongoing pain of a suitor perpetually and visibly denied to her. And Eleanor believed him truly dead. She did, for the better part of 2 years, and grieved him as such, quietly and privately, in the manner her father had raised her to grieve everything, without complaint and without display. Mrs. Vane's voice, when she continued, had grown quieter still. "It was I who told her the truth at last, Mr. Holmes, some 10 months past, when Thomas wrote to me, for we had kept a correspondence, he and I, out of what I can only call an old debt of conscience on my part, to say that he had returned to England in modest but respectable circumstances, and asked only to know that Eleanor was well and happy before he troubled her further, or troubled her not at all. I judged, rightly or wrongly, that a woman deserves to know the truth of her own grief before she marries another man upon a falsehood I myself had helped construct. I called upon Eleanor that single afternoon her household so dimly remembers, and I told her everything. And she chose him, said I, over the marriage her father had arranged to save his business. She chose the truth, Doctor, which is not quite the same thing, though it amounted, in the end, to the same result. She did not act rashly. I want that understood, above all else, for I think it does her a disservice to imagine her some love-struck girl fleeing into a sailor's arms upon a moment's impulse. She spent the better part of a year weighing what she owed her father against what she owed herself, and in the end, she concluded that she could not build a lifetime's marriage upon a lie two other people had told her, however kindly intended, and however desperately her father's fortunes required it. She asked me to help her leave in a manner that would spare her father the scandal of a broken engagement, and spare Mr. Carraway the public humiliation of a bride who simply refused him at the altar. And I confess, Mr. Holmes, that I found myself unable to refuse so careful and so considerate a request, whatever risk it carried for myself. Holmes was silent a long moment, turning his untouched glass of sherry slowly between his fingers. "There is one matter you have not yet accounted for, Mrs. Vane," said he at last. "Mr. Edmund Carraway's cufflinks. He wears, at present, a pair he claims were purchased to replace an earlier gift, stolen from his chambers some months past. I do not believe him, and I do not believe you are entirely ignorant of why." For the first time since we had entered that room, something like genuine surprise crossed Mrs. Vane's composed features, followed, a moment later, by a slow, considering smile. "You are more thorough than I gave you credit for, Mr. Holmes. Very well, I will tell you, though I confess it is a smaller matter than the rest, and touches upon Mr. Carraway's own conscience rather more than upon Eleanor's disappearance. He knew, Mr. Holmes, not everything, not the hidden stare, not the manner of her leaving, but he knew, these 3 months past, that Eleanor's heart lay elsewhere, for she told him herself, in a private conversation neither he nor she has spoken of since. He chose to proceed with the marriage regardless, believing, not unreasonably, from his own point of view, that affection might grow where it did not yet exist, particularly once bolstered by the settlement his family's fortune would bring to Fairweather's failing business. The cufflinks were a gift from Eleanor herself, early in their courtship, which he quietly disposed of once he learned the truth of her feelings, unable, I think, to bear wearing so plain a token of an affection he now understood to be borrowed rather than truly given. It is not villainy, Mr. Holmes. It is only the ordinary, sad compromise of a man convincing himself that a marriage of convenience might yet grow into something warmer, if only given time enough to try. I confess I found myself, in that moment, rather moved by the picture that had slowly assembled itself before us. Not a tale of villainy at all, in the end, whatever its outward trappings of locked doors and hidden stairs and false reports of drowning, but a quiet, sorrowful tangle of ordinary human hearts, each doing what it believed it must, and each, in its own way, deserving of more sympathy than blame. "Where is she now, Mrs. Vane?" Holmes asked, very quietly. "And where is Thomas Rourke?" Mrs. Vane studied him a long moment before she answered, weighing, I think, some final calculation of trust. "Aboard the merchant vessel Cormorant, Mr. Holmes, bound for the Cape and points beyond, where Thomas has secured, through honest work these 2 years past, a modest but respectable position as second officer, enough, I am told, to keep a wife in comfort, if not in the manner her father once hoped for her. They sail within hours. If you mean to stop them, I cannot prevent you, for I have told you all I know, and I will not compound one deception with another by lying to a man who has already seen through every deception I have offered him tonight." "I have not come to stop them, Mrs. Vane," said Holmes, rising at last, and setting down his still untouched glass of sherry with the particular gentleness of a man closing a difficult conversation with as much grace as it will allow. "I have come, I think, only to see the end of a story that began in a locked room, and deserves, I believe, to end somewhere rather more open than that. Come, Watson, I think we have one more call to make tonight, before the tide turns without us." Interlude: The Harbour Master's Ledger. We did not go directly to the docks, for Holmes, ever mindful of the difference between urgency and haste, insisted first upon a stop at the small shipping office near Wapping Old Stairs, where a weary clerk kept the tide tables and sailing schedules for half the merchant vessels working out of the Pool of London. "The Cormorant, you say?" the clerk murmured, running one ink-stained finger down a long column of figures by the light of a single low lamp, while outside the window the fog pressed close and grey against the glass, and somewhere beyond it a foghorn sounded, low and mournful, from a vessel already feeling its way out toward open water, bound for the Cape, cargo of manufactured goods and mail. "Yes, here she is. Tide's due to turn at 4:30 this morning, sir, and a captain worth his salt won't miss it for love nor money, not this season, with the autumn gales already making up beyond the Nore. If she's not away by 5, she'll sit another full day waiting on the next tide, and no captain fond of his owner's patience lets that happen if he can help it." Holmes glanced at the clock upon the office wall, and I saw him do the swift, silent arithmetic that I had watched him perform 100 times before, in 100 different crises. The kind of calculation that took him perhaps 2 seconds and left the rest of us, invariably, a full minute behind him. "We have," said he, "a little under 3 hours, Watson, and a cab that will need to make better time through this fog than any sensible driver would ordinarily attempt. And if we do not reach her in time, then Miss Fairweather sails without knowing that her father will be told the truth of her leaving, rather than left to imagine whatever horror his own grief invents for him," said Holmes gravely, already moving toward the door. "I do not know, Watson, that I could forgive myself so poor a use of the hours we have already spent, if we allow the very last of them to slip away through simple carelessness. The cab ride that followed remains, even now, among the strangest half-hours I ever spent in Holmes's company. Not for any danger in it, for there was none, but for the particular quality of that fog, thick and close, and lit only by the intermittent, swimming gold of gas lamps along streets grown suddenly unfamiliar in the murk. Our driver, a stolid, weathered man who plainly knew those riverside streets by long habit rather than by sight, took us at a pace I would ordinarily have thought reckless, and Holmes sat forward the whole way, his stick gripped tight across his knees, watching the fog part and close around us with an intensity that told me, more clearly than any words could have, how very much this particular arrival mattered to him. We passed, at one point, a church clock striking the half-hour, its chime muffled and strange in the fog, and I remember thinking, in that moment, how very like the whole case it seemed, a sound one could hear perfectly well and understand perfectly well, and yet could not quite locate, muffled as it was by a London that had wrapped itself, that whole strange autumn, in grey uncertainty from the very first knock upon our door to this last, breathless race against a turning tide. "There," said Holmes at last, as the cab lurched around a final corner and the black water of the river opened suddenly before us, pale masts rising ghost-like out of the thinning fog along the wharves. "There, Watson, we have not lost her yet." Chapter 8. Dawn at the docks. The night had turned very cold by the time our cab drew up along the wharves below the Pool of London, and the fog that had held off, thin and half-hearted, through the earlier hours of the evening had rolled in thick and proper now, curling low across the black water and wrapping itself around the masts and rigging of the moored vessels, until they seemed less like ships than like the ghosts of ships, half dissolved into the grey. Holmes had said little on the drive down, save to instruct our driver, with unusual urgency, to make what speed the fog and the hour allowed, and I confess I spent the journey turning over in my mind all that Mrs. Vane had told us, and finding, the more I turned it, less and less appetite in myself for any manner of arrest, or exposure, or the cold machinery of scandal that might yet be set in motion, should we choose to set it so. We found the Cormorant by her lanterns before we found her by her name, 3 tall masts rising pale and indistinct out of the fog, her deck alive with the low, unhurried business of a crew preparing for a dawn tide. coiled ropes, murmured orders, the creak of timber settling against the swell. A gangway still stood lowered against the quay, and it was there, at its foot, in the thin grey light of a lantern hung from an iron post, that we found them. I had not known, until that moment, quite what I expected Eleanor Fairweather to look like. Some pale, haunted creature, perhaps, worn thin by months of secret preparation and a lifetime of careful obedience, finally, desperately broken. What I found instead was a young woman standing very straight and very still at the rail of a departing ship, a plain travelling cloak wrapped close against the cold, her dark hair simply dressed, her face, in that uncertain lantern light, wearing an expression I can only describe as quiet and complete resolve. Not triumph, not fear, but the settled calm of a person who has, after long and careful thought, chosen her own course and does not intend to be argued out of it now. Beside her stood a tall, weathered young man in a plain officer's coat, his hand resting, lightly and protectively, upon the rail beside hers, and I understood, without needing to be told, that I looked at last upon Thomas Rourke, restored from his false grave, 2 years drowned and 2 years living, both at once. It was Eleanor who saw us first, and I watched her whole body go still, with a fear so immediate and so complete that it struck me, even across that distance, like a physical blow. The fear I understood at once, not of discovery for its own sake, but of losing, at the very last hour, the only escape she had spent a year of her life so carefully constructing. "Mr. Holmes," her voice, when it reached us across the narrow gap of fog and water, was steady, though I could hear, beneath its steadiness, how much that steadiness cost her. "I will not go back. Whatever you have come to say, whatever my father has sent you to demand of me, I will not go back to that house, nor that marriage, nor that room. You may take me before a magistrate if you believe some crime has been done here, but I will not board that gangway of my own will, and I do not believe you can force me up it without a good deal more violence than I think a man of your reputation is inclined to use." Holmes stood a long moment at the foot of that gangway, the fog curling about his coat, and when he answered her, his voice carried none of the cold, precise authority I had heard him use upon 100 criminals in 100 such confrontations before. It carried, instead, something I had rarely heard from him at all, a kind of grave and careful tenderness. "Miss Fairweather," said he, "I have not come to take you anywhere. I have come, I think, only to see for myself that the woman I have spent 3 days chasing through locked rooms and hidden stairs is indeed as capable and as clear-sighted as the trail she left behind suggested her to be. I confess I find, now that I stand before you, that she is a good deal more so." I saw something loosen, very slightly, in the set of Eleanor's shoulders. Not trust, not yet, but the first small easing of a fear that had plainly been coiled tight within her for a very long time. "You are not here for my father, then. I am here, in some measure, for your father, Miss Fairweather, though not in the manner you fear." Holmes glanced up at Thomas Rourke, who had said nothing yet, but whose hand had tightened, I noticed, very slightly upon the rail. "Your father believes, at this hour, that you have either been taken from him by violence or have perished by some misadventure he cannot yet name. That belief is destroying him a good deal more thoroughly, I think, than the truth would, however painful that truth might first appear. I would ask you, before this ship sails, to permit me one honest conversation with him, not to persuade you back, for I do not believe that is my place, nor do I believe it would succeed if it were, but to let him know that his daughter lives, and chose her own life freely, rather than let him spend whatever years remain to him, believing himself the father of a girl, either stolen or dead. I think you owe him that much mercy, Miss Fairweather, whatever else you no longer owe him." Eleanor was silent a long moment, her eyes moving between Holmes and myself, and then, at last, to the fog-wrapped city behind us, its scattered lights burning faint and gold through the grey, the only home, I imagine, she had ever truly known, now receding from her with every minute that ship sat waiting at the tide. 35. Tell him, said she at last, very quietly, that I am not lost. Tell him I am found, at last, for the first time in a very long while, and that I am sorry, sincerely and entirely sorry, for the grief this has cost him, but that I could not have bought his peace with the whole remainder of my own life, however dearly I love him. Tell him that, and tell him nothing more, for I think anything more would only give him some new thread to follow, and I have had, Mr. Holmes, quite enough of being followed. I will tell him precisely that, said Holmes, and no more. It was Thomas Rourke who spoke then for the first time, stepping forward to the rail, his weathered young face grave and earnest in the lantern light. Mr. Holmes, I know what this must look like. A runaway bride, a sailor come back from a false grave, a family's fortunes left in ruin behind us. I'll not pretend I don't understand the harm we do in leaving as we do. But I love her, sir, and have loved her since we were little more than children, and I'll spend the whole of whatever life I'm given trying to be worthy of the risk she's taken to be with me. That's all I can offer you, or her father, or anyone else who asks the question. It isn't much, against a wool merchant's ruined fortune, but it's honest, and it's everything I have. Holmes regarded him a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, extended his hand. It is, in my experience, Mr. Rourke, a good deal more than most men manage to offer, honestly, in the whole course of their lives, said he. I wish you both fair winds, and a kinder harbour than the one you are leaving. We did not stay to watch the cormorant cast off, though I confess I paused, at the top of the quay, and looked back once through the thinning fog, and saw the ship already beginning to draw slowly away from her berth, her lanterns growing small and gold and distant, until they seemed, at last, no more than a handful of low stars settled upon the black water of the Thames. It fell to Holmes to break the news to Josiah Fairweather, later that same grey morning, and I will say only that he did it with a gentleness I had rarely seen him extend to any client in the whole course of our long association, sparing him the hidden stare, sparing him the false report of Rourke's drowning, sparing him every detail that might have curdled his grief into anger, and offering him, in its place, only the single essential truth his daughter had asked us to carry, that she lived, that she had chosen her own life freely, and that she loved him still, whatever distance now lay between them. Fairweather wept when he heard it, not the sharp, broken weeping of a man newly bereaved, but something slower and older, and I think, in its way, a good deal more healing than the alternative might have been. He asked no further questions. He did not, so far as I ever learned, attempt to follow the trail we had so carefully left untold. He closed up the bridal chamber, some weeks later, and let it stand empty, and told his household, when they asked, only that his daughter had gone abroad to be married, which was, in its essential truth, no lie at all. Fog lifting over the Thames. Holmes and I did not return to Baker Street directly, that grey and quiet morning. We walked instead along the embankment for a while, in the particular, unhurried silence that had always existed easily between us, the kind of silence that asks nothing and fills itself, without effort, with the simple comfort of shared company. The fog was lifting as we walked, thinning by slow degrees into the pale gold of a proper autumn dawn, and the Thames, which had shown us nothing the night before but black water and drifting grey, now lay spread before us in long, quiet sheets of silver and amber, the first watermen already out upon it, the first gulls wheeling low and calling over the widening light. Somewhere far downriver, beyond the last visible bend of the water, a ship with 3 tall masts was carrying 2 young people toward a life neither London nor Whitechapel nor a wool merchant's ledgers would ever again have any claim upon, and I found myself, walking there beside Holmes in that thin morning gold, glad of it, in a way I had not expected to feel at the close of a case that had begun with such fear and such confusion. "You are quiet this morning, Watson," said Holmes at last, breaking a silence that must have stretched the better part of a mile. "I am thinking," said I, "that this is the strangest case I have yet followed at your side, Holmes, and not merely for its locked doors and hidden stairs. We set out 3 nights ago believing we chased a crime. We have ended by quietly assisting an escape, and I find I have no regret in it at all, which is, I think, rather a strange note for a case to end upon." Holmes was silent a moment, watching the light move upon the water. "I have long believed, Watson, that the law and justice are not always the same creature, however closely they are made to resemble one another in the courts and the newspapers," said he at last. "The law asks only whether a rule has been broken. Justice asks a harder question, whether the breaking of that rule has served or harmed the deeper truth of a person's life. Eleanor Fairweather broke no law that any magistrate in this city could name, Watson, whatever scandal her departure may yet cause. She broke only a silence that had been imposed upon her, gently but completely, since the day her mother died, and left her to be raised by other people's expectations rather than her own desires. I confess, I find I have very little sympathy to spare for the rule she is accused, by no one but her own conscience, of having broken. And Mrs. Vane, a woman who fabricates deaths and builds secret passages for a living, do you not find something troubling in the ease with which she does it?" "I find a great deal troubling in it, Watson, in the abstract," said Holmes. "In the particular, I find a woman who used a strange and morally uncertain trade to spare an old man 2 years of needless grief, and a young woman a lifetime of needless imprisonment in a marriage built upon a comfortable lie. I do not say her trade is without its dangers, nor that I should wish to see it practiced freely and without conscience across this city. But I have learned, in the whole of my career, that the world's true villains rarely trouble themselves to build such careful, such patient, such fundamentally kind constructions as the one we found last night behind that bridal chamber's wardrobe. Villainy is, in my long experience, Watson, a far lazier business than mercy. It is mercy that requires the greater cunning." We walked on a while longer in silence, the sun climbing slowly higher over the widening river, the fog burning away at last into a clean, pale autumn morning, and I found myself thinking, as I so often did at the close of one of our stranger adventures, that I had married into a life of ordinary domestic contentment, and had somehow never quite managed to leave behind the extraordinary company of the man walking quietly beside me, nor, if I am entirely honest with this journal, and with you, my patient listener, had I ever truly wished to. Chapter 9. The Return to Baker Street. It was well past noon by the time we came again to our own rooms, and Mrs. Hudson, bless her, had kept a fire built up warm and waiting despite the 2 nights we had left it untended, along with a plate of cold beef and bread that neither of us, in our exhaustion, had thought to ask for, but both of us fell upon with an eagerness that rather surprised me. Holmes ate little, as he generally did at the close of a case, his mind still moving, I could tell, through the last remaining corners of the puzzle we had only just laid to rest. He settled at last into his chair by the fire, his pipe lit, his long legs stretched toward the flames, and it was there, in the warm and settling quiet of that familiar room, that he did what he so loved to do, and what I so loved, in turn, to hear, laying out for me, from beginning to end, the whole shape of the reasoning that had carried us from a midnight knock upon our door to a departing ship upon a fog-cleared river. "You will want it in order, Watson, I expect, for that journal of yours," said he, a faint, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Very well, let us walk it through, as a man walks back through his own footprints in the snow, to see how straight or how crooked a path he has actually taken." He drew slowly upon his pipe before continuing. "We began, as we so often do, with an apparent impossibility. A woman vanished from a bolted room, with no window that could be opened, and no chimney that could admit a person. The temptation, in such cases, Watson, is always to search first for some clever mechanical trick by which the impossible is rendered merely difficult. A false wall, a hidden panel, some ingenious device of ropes or mirrors. I confess, I fell prey to that temptation myself, for a time, and it was not entirely wasted effort, since a hidden panel did, in the end, prove to be part of the truth. But I ought to have attended more closely, from the very first hour, to the smaller and stranger details that did not fit so tidy a picture. The hairpin dropped 3 feet from the dressing table, which told us of haste or agitation in a girl her own father swore was never careless. The undisturbed bed linens, which told us that whatever had happened in that room had not happened at the hour of sleep, but at some earlier, wakeful time. And the candle, guttered unevenly in a sealed room, which told us, before we knew anything else at all, that some current of moving air had passed through that chamber, which had no business being there. The locksmith's testimony changed the whole shape of the case, said I. It did more than that, Watson. It changed the whole nature of the question we were asking. Once I understood that the very bolt used to prove the room sealed from within could, in fact, be thrown with equal ease from the passage without, I understood that we were no longer investigating a mystery of ingress at all. We were investigating a mystery of intention. A woman does not commission so particular and so secret a mechanism from a locksmith unless she intends, at some future hour, to make use of it herself, or unless someone intends to use it upon her, which was, I confess, a possibility I did not fully discard until we found the note in the hidden chamber, in her own unmistakable hand, written with a calm that no coerced captive could ever have managed. He paused, drawing again upon his pipe, watching the fire settle. The lullaby troubled me more than almost any other detail in the whole affair, Watson, and I confess I did not fully understand its meaning until nearly the very end. A woman does not sing to herself, alone, in a foreign tongue, in the hours before what she believes will be either her wedding or her escape, unless that song carries some deep and private meaning quite outside the ordinary business of the case. I believe now, though I did not think to ask, and perhaps it was not mine to ask, that it was a song Thomas Rourke had taught her, some tongue he had picked up in his years at sea, a private language between the two of them that predated her engagement to Mr. Carraway by a good many years. She was not merely preparing to leave that room, Watson. She was saying goodbye to it, in the only language she trusted not to be overheard and understood by anyone but herself. I found, hearing this, that I was obliged to look away from him a moment, toward the fire, for there was something in the image of that quiet, careful girl, singing her private farewell to a life she had never truly chosen, that moved me a good deal more than I had expected any detail of the case still could, so many hours after its resolution. And the ledger, said I, when I had composed myself, Fairweather's debts. The ledger gave us motive, Watson, but it very nearly misled us as well, and I want to be honest with you about that, since I think a case is better remembered whole, with its false turns included, than polished smooth into a straight line it never truly followed. I believed, for a time, that Eleanor's disappearance was purely and simply an act of rebellion against a marriage arranged to save her father's fortune, a reasonable theory, and one that fit a good deal of the evidence. It was only Mrs. Vane's account that revealed the deeper and, I think, the truer motive beneath it. Not rebellion against an arranged marriage in the abstract, but a very particular refusal to build a life upon a lie two well-meaning people had told her about a man she had never stopped loving. Had Thomas Rourke truly drowned, Watson, I believe Eleanor Fairweather would have married Edmund Carraway as planned, and grieved her first love quietly and privately for the whole remainder of her days, as her father raised her to grieve everything, without complaint and without display. It was the discovery of the lie, not the marriage itself, that she could not forgive. And Caraway's cufflinks, a small thread, Watson, and one I confess I followed more out of habit than any conviction it would prove essential. But it told me, before Mrs. Vane confirmed it outright, that Caraway himself was not entirely the innocent, grieving bridegroom he first presented himself as. A man does not quietly dispose of a token given him by the woman he loves unless something has already begun to sour between them, long before the wedding night that never came. I do not think ill of him for it in the end. He was, I believe, doing precisely what Eleanor's father had raised her to do, accepting an arrangement built upon incomplete truth, and hoping quietly that affection might grow to fill the gaps that honesty had left behind. It is, I think, a very ordinary human failing, Watson, however extraordinary the circumstances that surrounded it in this particular case. The fire had burned low by the time he finished, and outside our windows, Baker Street had settled into the ordinary golden hush of a London afternoon, cabs rattling past, a barrel organ playing somewhere faint and tinny down the street, the whole vast ordinary city going about its business, entirely unaware of the quiet, extraordinary mercy that had been carried out 2 nights before in a bridal chamber not 3 miles from where we sat. "Will you write it up, Watson?" Holmes asked at last, watching me with that particular, faintly amused expression he always wore when he asked me this question, as though he already knew the answer before I gave it. "I believe I shall," said I, "though I confess I do not yet know how I shall end it. There is no arrest to report, Holmes, no villain brought before a magistrate, no tidy moral for the newspapers to print beneath a suitably dramatic headline, only a young woman who chose her own life, and an old man learning, very slowly, to let her have it." "Then perhaps, Watson," said Holmes, closing his eyes at last and settling deeper into his chair, "that is precisely the ending it deserves. Not every case closes with handcuffs and headlines. Some close only with a ship sailing quietly out to sea, and 2 people left behind who must learn, each in their own time, to be glad of it rather than to grieve it. I have come, over the years, to think those the harder cases, Watson, and very often the better ones." Epilogue. A fire burning low. I have thought a great deal, in the years since that autumn, about what became of the people whose lives crossed so briefly and so strangely with ours during those 3 fog-bound days. I never learned, with any certainty, where the Cormorant made her final harbour, nor whether Eleanor Fairweather, Eleanor Rourke, I should say now, wherever she settled, ever found the ordinary, unremarkable happiness she had risked so very much to reach for. I like to believe she did. I have found, over the long course of my life, that a case leaves you gentler company at night if you allow yourself to believe the kinder ending, where the evidence permits it, and I confess the evidence, in this particular case, permitted it rather generously. Josiah Fairweather's business did not recover, in the end, though it did not entirely collapse either. He sold the Whitechapel house some 2 years later, I am told, and took smaller, quieter rooms nearer the river, where he lived out his remaining years in a modest comfort, rather removed from the prosperous respectability he had once hoped his daughter's marriage would secure for him. Holmes called upon him once more, some months after the case had closed, on some pretext of a minor legal matter, and told me afterward, with a quietness I did not often hear in his voice, that the old man had seemed, if not happy, then at peace, in a manner he had not been during those 2 frantic, fog-bound nights we first knew him, as though the loss of his daughter's presence had cost him a great deal less, in the end, than the earlier, quieter loss of her trust might once have done, had she gone through with a marriage neither of them truly believed in. Edmund Caraway married, within the year, a young woman of his own choosing, and I understand, from the small and unreliable gossip that reaches even a busy physician's ears, that theirs proved a contented match, built, I like to think, upon rather more honest foundations than the one Mrs. Vane's careful architecture had spared him from entering unknowingly. Mrs. Agatha Vane, so far as I am aware, continued her strange and morally uncertain trade for a good many years thereafter, undisturbed by Scotland Yard, unremarked upon in any newspaper, known only to that quiet circle of Londoners who required, from time to time, the particular and delicate mercy she alone seemed equipped to offer. Holmes never spoke of reporting her, and I never asked him why, for I believe I already understood the answer better by the time that case had closed than I had at its beginning. As for Sherlock Holmes and myself, we returned, as we always did, to the ordinary rhythms of our shared life above the tobacconist's shop, to violin music at odd hours, to newspapers scattered across the breakfast table, to the long, comfortable silences of two men who had long since stopped needing conversation to feel the comfort of each other's company. It was, I think, one of the quieter cases we ever shared, for all its locked doors and hidden stairs, and I have found, in writing it out at last for this journal, that it has stayed with me rather more gently than many of our louder and bloodier adventures. A reminder, perhaps, that not every mystery worth solving ends in justice as the law understands it, and that mercy, quietly and carefully constructed, can be its own kind of solution to a puzzle that seemed, at first glance, to have no honest answer at all. And there, friends, the fire has burned down low, just as it always does at the end of these evenings together, and I think it is time, at last, to let you go. I hope Baker Street was kind to you tonight. I hope the fog settled soft around you, and the gaslight burned low and gentle behind your eyes, and that somewhere between that midnight knock and this quiet, settling fire, you felt yourself grow just a little heavier, just a little further from waking, the way I always hope these journal entries might carry you. If this evening gave you some small comfort, I would ask only one thing of you before you drift the rest of the way to sleep. Not a donation, not a subscription to anything but this quiet corner of the internet. Only this: leave a comment, if you're able, and tell me you made it safely through the fog tonight. Tap that small subscribe button so that Watson's Journal is here again waiting for you tomorrow evening whenever you next need somewhere quiet to rest your thoughts. And if you know someone else who might sleep a little easier with Holmes and Watson for company, tell them where to find us. That is all I will ask. No more than that, ever. Sleep well, my friends. Baker Street will still be here tomorrow night. Fire lit, kettle on, and another case already waiting patiently in the fog for us to find it. Good night.